I have spent the last 24 hours just calcing and theory crafting, so if you could please share this video, I'd really appreciate it. We have a lot to go over today. Hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be talking about the new reaction changes that have just been leaked, as there's a lot of confusion regarding how good these changes actually are, with people asking me how good or bad certain things are, and I will try to put that all in perspective. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. And with that, let's begin. So basically what Hoyoverse decided to do is increase the base multiplier of multiple different transformative reactions. Transformatives being the reactions that only scale off of your levels and elemental mastery. Every transformative reaction has a different base multiplier which correlates to the amount of damage they do when you trigger them, and the higher the number, the more this damage scales off of your elemental mastery and character level. The highest base multiplier we have for reactions is Hyperbloom and Burgeon at 3, which is just one of the reasons why you can make teams like Hyperbloom and Burgeon carry you just off of their damage alone, assuming you can trigger it enough times. And most of the other transformatives just didn't really have multipliers close to as effective as this until today. Superconduct went from a pitiful 0.5 base damage to 1.5, Shatter doubled going from 1.5 to 3, which is the same as Hyperbloom and Burgeon. Electro also practically doubled going from 1.2 to 2, which is actually technically higher due to how Electro works, but we'll talk about it. And Overload went from 2 to 2.5. Now if I'm not a dumbass, it should be on screen already, but here's a chart visualizing just how impactful these changes are. And as you can see, yes, this is a lot. But enough yap, let's actually talk about these in detail. Starting with the reactions that benefited the least, Superconduct is still bad. This doesn't really change anything, and you aren't going to run EM based Superconduct teams, as its multipliers still aren't high enough to justify this, but it is something you can do if you want to. I just wouldn't recommend it. Eula and Fremine also don't trigger Superconduct enough on their teams either, to where again you're really going to feel an impact. At this point they should really just remove the damage that Superconduct does and give us like 100% physical rest shred instead. It would do physical damage dealers a lot more wonders, especially with the amount of enemies that have high physical resistance. TLDR, it's still shit, there isn't really much to say. Unfortunately, to my disappointment, Shatter is also still really bad, but unlike Superconduct, the issue isn't damage, it's just the practical issues that it has. Obviously the elephant in the room is that Shatter just doesn't function against bosses at all, so if you build an EM based Shatter trigger, they will literally do nothing when up against an unfreezable enemy. And the second thing is that, to be fair, I did only get to look at physical characters, maybe it changes a lot more for other elements, but both Fremine and Eula just don't get enough Shatter triggers for this to be worthwhile. As you can see in the background footage of me testing with some teams, Eula barely applies cryo while she's on field, so this means you have to supplement it with a form of off-field application like Rosaria or Kaya. But even though someone like Rosaria has no ICD, she ticks too slowly to again get any meaningful shatter counts. And with Fremine, even on double Hydra teams, I was just not able to get more than 12 shatters. The other thing that sucks is being able to fit in an Electro unit. Shatter does physical damage, so physical debuffs will make it do more, and is the reason I wanted to use Eula and Rosaria in the first place, as they both shred resistances so much, which allows her to shatter for close to 40k on a full EM build. But the problem is that fitting in an Electro unit means you have to sacrifice extra cryo or Hydra application, so even though your shatters hit harder, you end up getting less. So building Eula and Fremine with crit is still going to be your best bet. If we compare it to Hyperbloom, it's able to do around 20 or more procs in a rotation, while always having easy access to Deepwood being an artifact set, as well as having artifact sets that further boost Hyperbloom damage, on top of the fact that with Claymore characters you have to be on field to trigger Shatter, with the most popular Hyperbloom triggers are consistently doing it off field, and you are even getting Hyperbloom procs during your support setting up, which is the reason why despite having the same base damage, Hyperbloom is just superior. Shatter teams that include funky albedo stuff are going to be like 2 times more effective, but that still isn't enough to make them anything meta worthy. It should still be significantly easier to have fun with the teams though now, which is a positive. So yeah, physical really doesn't benefit at all from these changes, but if let's say they release Citlali and we know she's a shielder from what reliable data miners have said, what if her shield is able to tick and do damage similar to Xinyan's, but each time it does, it will deal blunt damage, which is what causes Shatter to break. And if they also make her shield scale with EM and incentivize the use for Superconductor physical teams, then she's potentially doing like 300k damage per rotation from Shatters alone. That would be insane, but it's probably not going to happen, but just a thought. Let's talk about the reactions that actually benefit a decent amount though. Isn't it amazing that you just like get sick as a human being? I recorded half of this video, went to bed, woke up with a sore throat, and now I am suffering, but at the same time I still want this video to get out, so I'm going to, despite being sick, carry on recording, so please bear with my disgusting voice. Okay, so with Overload, I have a lot of calculations to show you regarding how much this changes things, but before that I'd like to briefly explain why even with these changes, Overload still isn't going to be like this godlike reaction. The first is due to the fact that we still don't have a good reliable Overload trigger. You have to take into account that most Electro and Pyro characters have really slow application. Hyperbloom and Burgeon have tricked people into forgetting that Toma, Kuki, and Off-Field Raiden have standard ICD, and are only really applying Electro and Pyro like once every 3 seconds, which isn't a lot. On top of this, the faster Pyro and Electro applicators just do a lot of talent damage, to where it isn't worth throwing this away for overloads most of the time. But there is an exception where full EM Shangling is just her best build now, in which give me like 2 seconds I'm getting there. Also, unlike reverse reactions where you only consume half of the element you are reacting with, allowing you to get 2 reactions off of 1 aura, causing overload with 1 unit of Electro and Pyro will make it so that you just won't have enough aura left to react with. So for you to have a very consistent overload trigger, you would need to play a team where there is consistently really fast application of your aura element, and slightly slower but still fast application of your trigger element. And there are only a few ways to do this, but still very unstable, causing both of the characters to overload most of the time. So let's talk about what I found out. The first thing I wanted to look at was Chevreuse teams where you aren't building any of your characters with EM, to see what this would look like for most people. I looked at an Arlecchino, Bennett, Chevreuse, Fischl team, which is one of Arlecchino's best teams and her best Chevreuse team in single target. In this team, you're going to get 4 overloads from Arlecchino and 7 from Fischl for 11 overloads total. I also assumed that every character has 40 elemental mastery, which is just 2 rolls between all 5 of your artifacts, which I think is very likely. And in this case, before the changes, overload would deal about 48k damage per rotation, and now it's doing about 66k. So yeah, close to a 20k damage per rotation increase, which is kind of nothing. That's like a 1k DPS increase, which is going to be a general trend when looking at teams like this. If you aren't building a high amount of EM on someone in these teams, there's going to be close to no difference in their performance. I also extended this to look at Chevreuse Chlorine teams with Toma, in which you get a total of 8 overloads, which again causes the reaction damage increase of the team to be quite low. But if you notice something, Chlorine and Fischl apply enough Electro to where Toma can actually get a majority of the overloads on the team. So if you give Toma an EM Goblet and circle it with Ketane, his energy requirements still end up being quite high, so you need to build a lot to where it does hinder your EM a bit. But even then, you're adding a lot more damage to the team than the Arlecchino teams did, despite his slower Pyro application, which shows the potential for this archetype of team if it had better triggers. I am hearing my voice back. Why do I sound like a cartoon character? Anyways, this led me to think about Xiangling more than Tenten does. Her and Fischl have really fast application, so if you're able to further increase the amount of Electro application with an on-field Electro unit, you led me to this team, where you are getting 18 overloads, half of which are coming from Xiangling. Normally on this team you'd build her with crit and attack, as overloads didn't hit that hard enough to justify using it, but now on this team, building her with full EM is just better, and Xiangling shreds Pyro resistance with Guoba, further increasing the amount of overload damage you're able to do on all of your characters. And between Chevreuse and Raiden, Xiangling gets enough energy to where you're more justified in building over 1000 EM on her, while still meeting energy requirements. This is my personal favorite Raiden Chevreuse team, as it has no circle impact and I don't have to use Sora, so it's nice to see it get a minor buff, even if it doesn't end up being that significant. Now the last thing to cover in regards to overload is going to be overvape teams, which is a combination of vaporize and overload, as electrocharge coexists on an enemy, allowing you to vaporize and overload the same hit. I looked at 2 characters, Hu Tao and Xiangling. Honestly, there isn't really much to talk about. You build less EM on these teams, generally about 300 to 500, and you do also get some electrocharge ticks on your other characters. This makes it so that for both of these teams you're adding around 3000 to 4000 more DPS for free, which is the biggest increase you get for overload based stuff. In conclusion, overload received a lot of micro buffs across the board. This isn't significantly raising the bar for overload teams at all really. Full elemental mastery overload teams are simply just too unstable to be viable for Fischl and Xiangling universally, to where I can actually recommend going out of your way to build it, but at the end of the day, it's a free increase. I'm not gonna complain about it. Now let's move on to the big one, electrocharged. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, trying to calculate this was such an obscene pain in the ass. If this video doesn't do well, I'm going to cry. Anyways, especially with electrocharge, when I first saw these changes, I thought, oh, this is going to break the game, as he triggers so much electrocharge with Onoma units in AoE, right? Because I am an Electro main, and as someone who is the biggest biggest facial shield on the planet, I really wanted this to be the case. But after doing an extensive amount of research into the reaction, it's not nearly as impactful as we thought it would be. But before I tell you how big the increase is, as always, let me just give a dumbed down explanation of how the reaction works and some of its mechanics. Basically, you apply Electro and Hydro, then enemies will be electrocharged and take continuous electro damage, as long as you're consistently supplying Hydro and Electro to keep it going. Realistically, you do lose the electrocharge status quite a lot, but you can reapply it very fast, so it doesn't matter. It also spreads the damage in AoE if enemies have Hydro on them, we know this. The annoying part is who exactly triggers the reaction, as both Hydro and Electro coexist on enemies, but this is actually determined by who applies Electro or Hydro last, and that is where the concept of EC ownership comes into play. Usually fast applicators have higher ownership where the slower ones get less ownership, TLDR, but even then, if a slower applicator is able to apply Electro or Hydro right before electrocharge does damage, they will be able to gain ownership and take it away from the faster applicators, so it becomes very inconsistent in practice. So like with Overload on Hydro or Electro characters in this team, you just aren't building EM on them. However, Anima units exist who do have the ability to get electrocharge ownership, and the ones you use in these teams build full EM anyways. In single target, this does have to be from an absorption like Sucrose or Kazuha's Elemental Burst, as Anima characters can't apply Electro or Hydro in single target from swirling. So right off the bat, the first issue is that you barely get any electrocharge ownership as an Anima character in single target. Kazuha and Sucrose's absorbed abilities are just too slow and too short to get long-lasting EC ownership, and you would think that in AoE it's going to be so much better because they're now consistently applying Electro and Hydro in AoE from swirling, but also not really. It is so hard to explain this, but even if Sucrose is able to get both Electro and Hydro swirls, she could still not get ownership of electrocharge and do EC damage or a lot of it. This is because when electrocharge spreads to other enemies, it will actually just take ownership of said enemies, which can happen from a single target application like Xingqiu or Fischl. So even in multi-target, your Anima unit is never going to really have the most ownership of the reaction and trigger a lot of electrocharge damage. I went ahead and looked at two teams, the first being a standard Chlorined EC team. You add about 40,000 damage in single target, which is the same as Overload, but in AoE you naturally get more electrocharge procs. This makes it scale harder to where you're now increasing the damage per rotation, but oh my god, my nose is so blocked. You get the point. But yeah, Kazuha while off field just doesn't get a lot of EC ownership, and therefore I'd like to say that in my initial community post I did quite overrate how big of an increase this was, and I apologize for that. I will try and hold back my thoughts more in the future before doing all the testing first. And now, with Sucrose Taser, this team runs a longer rotation, and Sucrose actually being on field to consistently fight for EC ownership makes it so that you just get a lot better ownership than Kazuha in AoE. Another thing that Sucrose does which is amazing for this team is that she buffs her elemental mastery, so with Hawkish and Ring she's still giving 186 EM to the team, which on top of the 2 EM rolls I'm assuming, makes all of them have 240 elemental mastery. Out of every team I calculated, this just gives Sucrose Taser the biggest increase here, adding over 100,000 damage per rotation for again literally free. Then if we look in 2 target situations, you are adding close to 200,000 damage per rotation. To be honest, I am a little disappointed by these results, considering just how massive this would be if Anima units could get better ownership, but at the same time this is literally just a free 5k DPS increase to this team that doesn't involve having to change your rotations or anything. So as I said prior, I'm not really sure I can complain about it. Overall, after doing all of this, the changes really don't play how you play the current characters or teams, or give them that much of a significant boost. I would also try and evaluate this for Chaska as well, but I'm not sure I want to open that kind of worms yet. Regardless, this is still again a free increase that is just an upgrade, just not that impactful at the current moment, as the reactions all have other issues besides damage. There are some other niche stuff I haven't looked into yet, like Shatter, Sino teams, or Soup teams, or other things of that nature that could benefit from these changes potentially. But if you want me to be completely honest, I kinda don't care about these teams enough. And with everything I've already looked at, I can already assume the outcome isn't going to create a new meta staple team. It will just allow you to get some better results out of those teams. Even if none of these changes are meta defining, at the same time there is also a fun factor to the game with experimentation, and a lot of people in my community posts have been talking about all the new teams they're going to try out, or that they've currently been playing with. So I hope that after the changes you guys managed to have fun with them. But with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts, as I'd love to hear it and I respond to almost every single comment. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.